Hi, my name is Keith Bailey. Welcome to my AEP855 Module 9 case study. So this was an interesting exercise. A lot of the material that we covered during the course I found to be very useful when kind of analyzing and putting together my process. So, taking us through first, let's look at the facts and the summary of the facts. So Richard Inman is a first-year assistant principal at Rocket Junior High who was contacted by a teacher who believes he witnessed James, a 15-year-old student with a discipline history, pass an item believed to be drugs to another student, David Ramos, a 13-year-old student with no prior record of behavioral incidents. I didn't include this in the case fact summary just for the purposes of keeping it condensed, but Mr. Inman has been working with James and serving as a mentor for him and some other students that have had some disciplinary challenges in the past. So he has some experience, but David was a student that he hadn't really dealt with before. So during the investigation conducted by the assistant principal and the school police officer, which took place, they conducted an interview taking place in the assistant principal's office. David was discovered to be in possession of a pair of brass knuckles, a prohibited weapon on school grounds. During the conversation, James volunteered the information that he gave the weapon to David to hold for him, and that he threatened to assault David if he did not comply with this request. At this point, both students were arrested for felony weapon possession and taken to a youth detention center where they would await prosecution as well as expulsion within 45 days, or for up to 45 days as per district policy. So Mr. Inman completed the expulsion paperwork for James, but hesitated to do so for David because of some of the extenuating circumstances. 3 days later, he was contacted by the director of secondary education who informed Mr. Inman that he would need to complete the expulsion paperwork or face an official reprimand. So, when we're thinking about some of the language from the standards, just with the case facts, we're analyzing decisions in terms of ethical frameworks in this particular case and looking at the case facts. So turning our attention to the legal and ethical issues, there are several legal issues at play in this particular case. We have two students facing felony charges related to possession of a weapon on school grounds. The assistant principal is at risk of breach of contract for failing to follow through with his obligation to file expulsion paperwork for David Ramos. There doesn't appear to be any issues related to discrimination or harassment in this case, but there is a lot of potential harm. So, when thinking about instances or situations with weapons in school, there are a number of parties that are potentially facing harm, both James and David at risk of serious long-term legal consequences, as well as impacts on their educational and professional futures due to expulsion and having a criminal record. The larger school community is at potential risk of harm. The students, if they're finding out that weapons are in school, could feel less safe in their school community. So, it's important to understand ethical and legal decision-making processes and how legal impacts can have an impact on the larger school community. So if we want to synthesize the problem into a one-sentence simple statement, Mr. Inman, the school's assistant principal, must determine whether it's ethical to expel both James and David Ramos, or if he should face a possible reprimand to support his ethical beliefs. So, he needs to demonstrate the capacity to evaluate ethical dimensions of issues and not just look at, A plus B equals C. So, looking at synthesizing the facts, we need to understand and demonstrate capacity to undertake and implement this work within a school setting. So looking at who are the people involved in this incident, what are the places, and what program or context does it take place in? So the people involved, Richard Inman, the assistant principal, James, a 15-year-old student with a previous history of some disciplinary and behavioral issues, and then David Ramos, a 13-year-old honor student. All of the actions in this particular case take place inside Rocket Junior Middle High School, but specific locations include the hallway where the weapon was exchanged, Mr. Inman's office where the student questioning or interviews took place, and then as well as the Youth Detention Center where the students were being held for prosecution and expulsion. Looking at the larger context, we're having to kind of guess a little bit at some of the facts, but based on the information, students are attending what I believe is a public junior high school in either a city or a suburban environment. There are some references to the south side, either of the city or of the town, and some challenging issues with behavior. Those things can happen in school settings of all different types, but utilizing the facts in the case, I would lean towards this being in a city environment or in a suburban environment. So prioritizing and reviewing the information. The facts in this particular situation presented a danger to the school community. The school community is a stakeholder in this particular instance. The students involved are stakeholders, the school board, the principal, the administration, the teachers. We need to kind of crystallize this information into what are the priorities here. So, we talk about dangers to students directly involved in the situation. We talk about the two students who are involved and the danger to them. We look about who was notified and were all the stakeholders notified in this case. And, based upon the facts, the larger student population, nor the parents outside of the parents of the two involved students were not notified. I think looking at how much information we have in this case, I think we have enough information to make a decision. And we need to demonstrate the capacity to evaluate those ethical dimensions of these issues. So what are some possible options and some possible consequences of those options? So we have three possible courses of action. One, Mr. Inman could take no action, could allow David to be expelled along with James, allow the criminal prosecutions to take place without any direct intervention. The second option would be to refuse to expel either student. James took responsibility for his actions. He's demonstrated growth. David was an innocent victim who acted under duress. The principal could argue that expulsion would be an overreaction for both students in this particular instance. The third or more likely options, I believe, would include that recognizing that due to James's actions, he threatened a student with violence. He was the student that brought the weapon to the school. He has a previous history of disciplinary and behavioral issues. That expulsion is the logical conclusion for James in this particular case. However, David's previous history and his extenuating circumstances present opportunities to consider alternatives to expulsion. These could include counseling, community service, other restorative actions that would have less harmful impacts on David's future than moving forward with the expulsion process. Choosing the best option. And I included on this particular slide a graphic of some of the ethical decision-making processes that you can see looking at who's potentially impacted, who are the stakeholders, what are the options that we have, what are possible consequences of those options, and then making the best decision that harms the least amount of people. So while the prosecution of the weapons charge is going to be out of the hands of the assistant principal, decisions around prosecutions tend to be made at the district attorney's office, at the police department, who have the discretion to decide what they want to make the arrest for. Mr. Inman can and should advocate for the charge to be reduced or for alternatives to be considered. Often for first-time offenders, the local justice system has alternative options instead of the traditional prosecution model. In terms of the expulsion process, Mr. Inman should advocate to the board to make an exception in this case and personally should follow his ethical code and refuse to complete the expulsion paperwork for David. He should inform the board of his decision, be ready to face any formal reprimand which might come as a result. This decision is going to minimize the negative impact on David's future, while also ensuring that James, the primary offender in this case, is being punished appropriately. When looking at this particular situation or this particular path, It's going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to demonstrate to the larger school body that students cannot bring weapons to school, that students will be held accountable, but that there are extenuating circumstances, and we're able to review those and take a look at those. We need to model ethical behavior in our personal conduct and relationships, and we need to cultivate that in other people. And this option allows for both of those things to happen. So if we were to imagine implementing this decision, what would happen? What would be the steps? Mr. Inman would meet with local prosecutors, would discuss the case regarding James and David, would request leniency in the charging of the case and recommend alternative options. The expulsion request for James would be processed. And during the 45-day period, Mr. Inman will continue to meet with James at the DAEP program to mentor James. He's not turning his back on the student. He's holding him accountable for the behavior, but he's showing him that he's still there for him, and he's still wanting and hoping to see James continue to grow and become a better young man. David would be permitted to return to school, be required to attend counseling sessions, as well as to complete a community service project as part of his restorative process. Mr. Inman would meet with the board, explain his decision-making process. If the board fails to agree, Mr. Inman would be willing to accept the formal reprimand. And looking at this and looking at the standard, we're really talking about communicating and advocating for both ethical and legal decisions that are the best option for the largest amount of people. So, again, going back to our standards, we have our standards here and our references. I thought that the case itself is a tricky one. In reality, because of zero tolerance policies that the majority of states have, the likelihood of avoiding prosecution and avoiding expulsion would probably be challenging in this case. I think that the board would probably step in and would advocate for expulsion. I've seen in my previous history students being arrested because they forgot and had a pair of scissors in their backpack when they went through the metal detector at school. So it might be challenging to avoid some of those things, but I think there are possibilities, and increasingly there are alternative pathways, especially when it comes to looking at the felony prosecutions for the students. This was an interesting exercise, an interesting ethical decision-making process, and really analyzing and breaking down the process and the thoughts. And I think that the option that I came up with was one that could be a workable one for all the parties involved. So thank you.